Hello, hello. We're live. Oh my gosh, I got a little echo. I think it's going to die down. Kate, you hearing an echo?
No.
Okay, awesome. We are here today. I'm Andrea Nakayama, and I'm here with Kate Smith, who I will introduce shortly, to map military concerns on the functional nutrition matrix. So here at the Functional Nutrition Alliance, we love the functional nutrition matrix. It really helps us to understand the story, the soup, and the skill of any patient population. And of course, on the 15-Minute Matrix podcast, we map all sorts of topics using the functional matrix to understand how everything is connected. We are all unique and all things matter. So of course, today we will be reminding you that every single patient is an N of one, meaning everybody is unique. But when we're looking at certain populations, there are ways that we can bring together our understanding of that population so we can work with more empathy to serve that population. And that's why I am so excited to have Kate here to help us to map military concerns. So Kate Smith, who you see here on the screen with me, has both a bachelor's and master's degree in education. She graduated with distinction from the United States Air Force Intelligence Weapons Instructor course and is now a certified functional nutrition counselor and a certified functional nutrition and lifestyle practitioner trained by us at the Functional Nutrition Alliance. Kate also has worked for many years as a United States Air Force Intelligence Analyst and Instructor. In addition, she's a military spouse of over 25 years, a mother of two, has deployed around the globe and lived all over the United States as well as overseas. So she's got real life experience to bring to the table in this conversation. Kate and her family now call Colorado Springs their permanent home, and she has a private nutrition practice there in Colorado Springs and volunteers at the only free women's health clinic in the area. In both parts of her business, her private clinic and in her volunteer work, Kate incorporates all of her training, experience, and passion to guide clients and patients to health. Kate, welcome to our Matrix session.
I know, I'm so excited to be here.
Yay. So we actually have a matrix that you created, a beautiful matrix, which I'm going to aim to share here. We don't currently have a PDF download for all of you who are here with us live, but I will try to get that and put it in the comments later if you'd like to see this. But if you can make your screen large in some way or another, you should be able to see this beautiful matrix. And this matrix, the functional nutrition matrix, as some of you may know, helps us understand the story, the ATMs, which we'll go over, the soup, which is the center section, and the skill. And the matrix reminds us that everything in the body is connected. We are all unique and all things matter. So, Kate, first and foremost, what was it like to map military concerns on the matrix?
It was like a giant brainstorming session. I put down a lot of things that pertained to me personally, like that I had gone through. And then I actually, yanked my husband into the play as well a little bit, and to help me think, broader. We have quite a few friends from different branches of service. So it really, yes, the very beginning part of it was me just kind of not verbally because I was writing, but I wrote down everything I could think of, and then kind of pulled from a few of my close friends, like, hey, is this something different if it's Navy or Army or, that kind of thing. So
good to recognize that, right, Kate? Like, we want to recognize that there will be differences based on service. There will be differences based on age, whether somebody's serving now or a veteran or a family member, gender, sexuality, like all of these things. We'll try to touch on them, but I just want to recognize that like there's a lot of differentiation, but this helps us come into the empathy of the overarching concerns.
It is. And as a reminder, I put most of those things are under the antecedents, just to remind people that those will be different based on whether, they were in the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, whether how long they were in service for, and all those different things. And even the generational time period that they served in. For example, service, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s are different from service now.
Yeah, really good point. So let's kind of anchor on those antecedents for a minute. And just antecedents are the things that we would be thinking about that are coming with the individual. So these would be anything from genes that we do or don't know about, past familial history of disease, like you said, generational trauma, generational conditions, how somebody was born, where they were born, the conditions they were born in, their birth order. All of those things are antecedents. But what did you include here as antecedents we might consider?
The first one is kind of the big one is that the term of, or the time, the age of service that's possible for someone is anywhere from the age of 18 up until they're 65 years old. 65 is the mandatory retirement or separation age for anyone in the military. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that the conception of what a veteran is might be different also based on what people think through. And that's the other reason I put the age range on here, because you could have a 21 or 22-year-old veteran that enlisted when they were 18, did 4 years of service, including combat deployments, and then separated from service and would be considered a veteran. So you could have a veteran that is very young, or you could have one that is on the aged side.
Yeah, so important. And when we think about, do you happen to know, when we're thinking about gender, what the makeup is in all of military service of male to female?
I don't. That is a great question that I should have Googled ahead of time.
That's okay. I mean, we're not going to know all the answers. We're not going to know them all.
It is still male dominated. I did look up, just so that I knew, women were encompassed in the military in 1948. So that's when women were allowed to serve. All combat jobs in the military, for anything that is specific to combat operations, there were some restrictions on those for quite some time. But in 2016 was when all military jobs were open to all genders.
And there's so many pieces here that's kind of amazing to think about. And there's been a lot of other restrictions, not just based on gender, but based on sexuality and the trauma that we might be aware of that's associated with sexual identity in the military. Also the why. I love, Kate, that you put the reason for joining differ. Mm-hmm. And as part of our assessment, understanding somebody's history, it might be, like you said, generational, it might be economic. There's lots of, it might be, really wanting to serve. What are some of those different reasons that you've come across?
Right. You touched on quite a few already. Some of it is a generational service that, my dad served, so I need to serve kind of thing. There are some where it's, I'm not ready for college, but I need to do something. So I'm going to join the military. There are even those that essentially it's a family threat, if you will, of you need to get your act together, so go enlist or go, that sort of thing. And there are those that come from a place of service. My story is kind of funny, but just as an example, I mean, my grandfather started flight training for World War II, but the war ended before he completed flight training. And so he was then not needed anymore. That's the only, at least in the near term for me, only person that has served in the military. But I watched Top Gun when I was in high school, and that was like, I want to be the girl, right? The Charlie with the curly hair. Yeah. So it may be just something like that. Maybe somebody went to the Army Navy football game or saw, one of the commercials on TV. So there's a myriad of different reasons, but yes.
Yeah, doing that investigation with our clients and patients to really uncover what was the reasoning. And then, as you said, like, somebody can be a veteran at any age and for any reason. Like, they can stop their, this is all new to me. So I'm just going to admit that, like, Kate's been my guide in working with a new group we're going to start working with. It's not of veterans or people who serve veterans, clinicians, but it's not in my lexicon. So can you end your service on your own at a certain point or after a certain point? And, like, somebody could get a traumatic brain injury early on after they've even done much and have like a hidden. I was watching a story recently where a young man was deployed. No, he was, what is it called when you're told to go home from service?
From deployment?
Yes.
Oh, he was just returned home.
So he was returned home because he fell, had a traumatic brain injury, but then he is a veteran who has a disability, but it's not a visible disability. And the guilt he felt for not having a visible disability, it's almost like he carried that around as this area of grief because his other fellow people who were returned home had more visible disabilities, and a TBI isn't visible.
Right. And that's kind of, I think that ties into some of the mind, spirit, emotions, like in the story part, or in the soup part of the matrix, because that survivor's guilt can be very heavy, especially if you are in an IED accident in a Humvee and there's 4 of you and 3 of you don't make it and 1 does, and so that is very common, especially in combat situations.
Okay, I want to get over there to the soup, but let's finish with the ATMs. No, I'm spending time. No, you're doing great. I'm eager to get over there because there's so much, but I just want to make sure we do cover that story, those antecedents, those triggers, and those mediators. So what are the triggers that we really should be thinking through when we're working with somebody who's serving or a veteran or a family member?
Sure. Did you want me to answer your when they can stop service question?
Oh, yes, please, because I don't know, and I'm so excited for all the things.
So in all good Functional Nutrition Alliance terminology, it depends.
Yes.
Yes. So it really does depend. When someone either enlists or goes through an officer training course, they will have what's called an active duty service commitment. Which is essentially, because we're putting you through this training you to do this, giving you skills, that kind of thing, then we need this much time from you type of thing. And so it really depends on how someone enters the service. And sometimes it even depends on what job they're doing. Pilots tend to have longer active duty service commitments because there's longer periods of training, more intense, different types of training that they go through. And then enlisted members can re-enlist, and officers have a certain amount based on whether or not, they had a scholarship that one of the military services helped pay for them to go to college. So it really does, it's a big giant, it depends, but someone can just separate from service when their active duty service commitment is up. You can retire from military service after a specific amount of years, which is what my husband very recently did after 27 years. You can also be medically retired. so that if there is something that happens to you, whether it's, you know, in training or in combat or on a deployment where the Air Force, you know, medical system determines that it's going to be really hard for you to continue to serve, they will retire you so that you get retirement benefits, even though you haven't served for the length of time that is normal for a retirement.
Okay.
Does that answer it?
It does answer. Thank you. And the reason why all this is so important is so that all of us, coaches and clinicians, can serve a population that we may not be as familiar with, and recognize that it's our job to have some familiarity, which is where the matrix is beautiful. And Janie shared a fact with us, a statistic here. It's 11% of veterans are veterans and women in 2021. I don't know what that means for those that are serving, but maybe that is familiar or similar.
Thanks, Janie.
Yeah, thanks, Janie. Perfect. Okay, so triggers
Yes.
we might be thinking about.
Multiple possibilities here. And honestly, I did my best to squirt them into the triggering events, you know, amount of space. You know, some of the bigger ones are the deployments, both combat and even what we would call temporary duty, because those temporary duty assignments are still away from where you're stationed, away from family, away from friends. Multiple relocations. You know, my daughter likes to, when somebody says, well, where are you from? She likes to go through the litany of all the, you know, places, the 7 schools and the, you know, how many different places she's lived. And so that one but can be a bigger trigger for even family members than necessarily the service member themselves, just because you're picking up, you're moving an entire house, you're leaving family or friends. We call them family by the time you know, hang out with them. It's right. The military family, but you're leaving people that you've gotten at least remotely close to over this course of, you know, 1 to 3 years or so, depending on how long your assignment is. The gender inequalities and or discrimination / you know, harassment can be a trigger. You know, like I said, tends to be a male dominated service industry, but progress is obviously being made. I mean, one of my first assignments was with, her name's Maria. She was the first female F-15C pilot. And we were stationed together, still keep in touch. She was one of Brad's, you know, instructors when he went through pilot training. So, but that was, you know, 1996, 95, 96-ish timeframe. So, you know, just that always feeling like you need to prove yourself thing could be a trigger. Obviously, trauma, both the small T, if you remember our trauma discussion from, during FBS, but both the small T and the big T variety, and also including that collective trauma where, you know, someone in the unit has been lost, whether it be combat or not, it's still the camaraderie within the unit is such a big thing that when you lose someone, there is collective trauma involved. And so I would consider the lack of continuity of medical care a trigger for stress, because the process of care is really hard. The other one that is super interesting to me is just all the different, I call them exotic because they're not the ones you normally hear, but sometimes multiple infections and sometimes multiple exotic infections from different deployments to different locations. Like I looked up just kind of the history, and even like back in 430 BC, the plague of Athens was part of the Peloponnesian War. Like that's kind of where it started, was between those soldiers and fighters at that time. And so there's malaria and dengue fever and all kinds of
exposures too, right? Like environmental exposures as well as those infections. Yeah, that we're not accustomed in our medical system necessarily to identifying or treating. So I have seen a number of people, especially after the Gulf War, like we didn't know what those were, and the long-term impacts were not really understood or studied.
Right. Yeah, that's one I have under environmental inputs.
Okay, well, we're going to head over there pretty soon. I just want to say also, Gail noted something that you and I have been talking about, Kate, just in terms of, I mean, trauma can mean so many things, and we don't want to gloss over sexual abuse. We don't want to gloss over any of the trauma that people have experienced for being different in any way, but just recognizing that the trauma bucket, big T and little t, are massive in and of themselves.
And that's kind of why I used that quick little blurb of trauma, both of the big T and little t, because there are so many things that can be encompassed. That way it's on the matrix to trigger us to think through all of those different possibilities.
Yeah, so heading over to the soup. Thank you. We'll get back to the mediators, because the mediators kind of really works with the skills area. So those dovetail really nicely. I don't know if my cursor shows up, but the mediators and the right side of the matrix work really nicely. But the soup here reminds us that everything in the body is connected, and it's hard to pick a place to start. But Kate, I think I'm going to start with the mind, spirit, emotions, and community, because we're talking about bringing empathy to a patient population. And this is something I think we just really need to be aware of. I mean, usually we like start with the gut, right? But like, let's start there with the mind, spirit, emotions, and community. What might we be thinking about?
So the other thing I wanted to make sure people note was I did use a plus and a minus for some of the bullets on the matrix, because there are some positive things that can affect in some of the areas. And those are some of my favorite in the mind, spirit, emotions, actually, is that there is a ton of community and camaraderie, both just in general being part of a military service, because that's 1% of our entire country's population. 1% of the population is a service member. So there's just community built into that. And then even within duty sections, like where somebody works, the camaraderie is also even closer, if you will. So and you're in a place of service to others and part of something bigger than yourself. And so those are those are my favorite pluses of all of it. And I have felt all of those, both as a service member and as a spouse. So I like those. I like to not just stick on the negative, but also go.
That is so important. It is so important when we're working with people. I was just teaching into this today, like when reviewing somebody's labs, for instance, how do we anchor the positive? You know what? This is what's working in your body. This is what's positive. Tell me about that, instead of just tell me your ailments and concerns, because it helps us shape a bigger picture. So thank you for adding the positives with those pluses into that. And those are beautiful. Really being part of something larger, being part of a community, being in service to others. Awesome.
Yeah, so those are my favorites. There is, the pushing hard can be a badge of honor, pushing yourself harder than you need to type of thing. Feeling like you're constantly under scrutiny. And then for a while, like kind of when I want to foot stomp a little bit, and note that the climate has shifted, is that for the longest time, seeking help for mental health issues carried a negative stigma for a really long time. Like you'll have some service members have a hard time asking for help in general, because doing so means, or to them anyway, would mean weakness, would carry a negative stigma. There used to be a time when going and asking for mental health help was nearly career ending. So, but there's a really big focus on trying to shift that perception, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so important. And I do think I've seen that shift happen as well. There's definitely more of an acceptance around that. But again, if we're thinking of the age or the time of service, we can
Right.
recognize that we're still helping people clinically that may feel even young people where it is more accepted. If we're looking at a male population and we're looking
Right.
at where they're coming from, may not be as comfortable sharing some of the mental health challenges and their feelings.
And even, I would even say, asking for help from any type of clinician is sometimes hard for service members because, I am this, I'm a soldier, I'm an airman, I'm a Marine, I don't need help, like that kind of thing. So
right. So if we move now, let's go ahead and move clockwise. So we're moving from that node of mind, spirit, emotions, and community. What might we be thinking about through a structural integrity arena?
Right. So this one, there were some, obvious things that came to my mind, but then I actually had a few discussions with some friends. And one of the most interesting to me was the angle of an aircraft ejection seat and pulling G's. So you and I are sitting or standing at 1G, like that's just gravity, right? And so even parajumpers, the paratroopers that jump out of airplanes have an initial G force when they jump out of a plane. And then when they launch the chute, that's an additional G force on their bodies. And essentially you're multiplying gravity on someone's, so that can mess with all kinds of structural things, whether it's, back problems, but just, imagine 9 times gravity being pushed on all of your internal organs, for a certain amount of time.
Right.
Not for very long, but still for, for seconds.
Repeatedly, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. The most aircraft ejection seats are like a normal chair. The one that is most interesting to me is that the F-16 is angled at 30 degrees and is now being looked at as causing some serious esophageal issues.
Wow.
Because of that angle. And when I was talking to Brad about this last night, he actually said there's a lot of F-16 pilots that sit up straight with no support because they don't like the 30-degree back angle. So then they're sitting up straight without support while flying, and then also staying that way without support when pulling G's. So structurally, that can do all kinds of things.
And that becomes upstream, right? Like if there's esophageal problems, we're going to see GI issues, and we're not necessarily getting to that it's a structural issue as opposed to a microbial issue or whatever it may be.
Right. And most of the time, the pilots that start down this track complain of heartburn and reflux first. And then somebody starts to really look into it and realize that there is literal like muscle and nerve damage because of the angle of the seat and adding so much gravity at one time. So that's just one of those that's kind of out there that I didn't think, necessarily a lot of people would think through, but was super interesting to me.
Yeah, definitely interesting. What other areas came up in structural integrity that were of interest? They're all of interest because we have to be thinking about people who are not sitting at a desk all day necessarily, right. But there may be some people sitting at a desk all day.
Yeah, which is why repetitive motion injuries even came up, because there are those that's part of the service is support to combat operations. And a lot of that does happen on a desk or at a desk on a computer, even, analysis and tracking things and different sorts of things happen with lots of typing. So that was why one of the things that I thought through when I put that one up there. Carrying a heavy, like a rucksack for somebody that is, in the field deployed, on average, the backpack itself is 40 pounds.
Wow.
And that's just the
that
backpack.
much. I've carried that much for a shorter period of time. It
Right.
is hard on the body
Yeah.
to be carrying. Yeah.
So imagine, marching from one location to, or walking, rucking really is what it's called, from one location to another, carrying that 40 pounds, miles on end, depending on where you are. And that doesn't even count like the gun you're carrying and the water that you're carrying. So they could be carrying upwards of 100 pounds at any given time, which is just a lot of weight for the body to hang on to and try to carry. And so, you'll get the structurally this just because it's,
Right.
it's not as easy to carry a 40-pound pack straight up. So.
Right. And
Yeah.
what this makes me think of, Kate, is how we go into a different level of inquiry, like past the intake form, to do a little bit more of discovery to find out what the reality was for that individual and the impacts or insults on their body, physically,
Right.
physiologically, mentally, psychologically. Like the amount of discovery is almost like a next step overlay, almost using the empathy matrix to go into that deeper level of inquiry.
The where I have found it come out the most in using the intake form for clients that I've had that have served is where we get to that have you ever spent any time overseas question. Like if I am doing an intake with someone in the military, I need a lot of space like under that. Like that's almost a whole nother sheet of paper in and of itself, because that's when we get the deployments and the relocations and the, my house had mold in this location and I was part of the burn pit crew at this location. And so that specific question for me triggers like literally a whole nother sheet of paper where we just timeline it out.
Right. Yeah. So important to remember. So structural, I want to move into GI, but anything else? Of course, we're talking about wounds. We're talking about riding in vehicles, the physical training in and of itself.
Yes. Lots of sprains and strains from, PT, physical PT, because they're required to meet certain physical standards. The riding in combat vehicles, like you'd think, okay, no big deal, but a Humvee does not have like your Kia Telluride shock absorbers. So any rock or whatever it's this, and someone can end up literally bonking their head on the top of a Humvee 4 or 5 times on, the road from A to B or even more. And then there's, of course, any of the rollover accidents or the improvised explosive devices, the IEDs that can trigger a rollover accident. I mean, you don't have airbags. So it's multiple different bumps to the head.
Bumps to the head and like a jarring, when I think about just that whole situation for the nervous system, right? Just that, like that bumping, that entire way of being for long periods of time. So much we could cover in each node. And I was like, maybe we'll skip this. No, we can't skip that node. So I will make sure that we have a PDF to put on the YouTube page. So anybody who wants a PDF of this document, I didn't get to have it made in time, but I will add it to the comments section of the YouTube page so you can go back and grab that. Let's talk about GI issues and what eating and meals are like for those that are serving.
Right. So again, this one's it depends. And it kind of ties over into the nutrition and hydration portion of the skills section of the matrix. There are different venues that a serviceman, if they're not living on base, then obviously they can do whatever, right? If you're living on base, especially young enlisted who live on base, you have the dining facility, which there are some healthier options available typically at the dining facility, or otherwise known as the chow hall. But most bases now have contracted eating establishments on base, but those are, and that's, this is the part that, because it's Burger King and Starbucks
right.
and Panda Express, and that's, hey, let's go grab a quick lunch and zoop through the drive-through. And so that's not even considering combat situations where it may be all that you have for a given amount of time are MREs, which are meals ready to eat. And those are literally in a package. I should have sent you a picture just because it's this like rubber pack, a brown rubber pack.
I think I've seen them.
Probably. That, has everything in it from, we used to joke about the turkey or the tuna noodle casserole and, turkey tetrazzini, spaghetti, and all of these are meant to last for 3 years.
Right.
They're so, right? 3 years in a package. And they're so, but they're also super high in sodium.
Right.
And calories, because they're like, no one's meant to sit down and eat an entire MRE as a meal, because there's literally like thousands upon thousands of calories in this one bag. So, long periods of time of eating that kind of stuff. And if those are out in the heat, like in a desert environment or Middle Eastern environment, they don't last for the amount of time that they're supposed to last. And so then you end up with gastrointestinal issues because the food in the bag has started to go bad. So that's, I love MREs.
Lots impacting things there. What about vitamin M? Tell me about vitamin M.
I knew you'd like that one.
Vitamin M.
Vitamin M, that was what we called it. And, I'll be honest, I got out in 2004, but even now people still refer to it as vitamin M. It's Motrin. And that was handed out for lots of different things at high dosages for the physical training, for the sprains and the strains, or the, the headaches, or the, all kinds of different injury type things. It wouldn't be unheard of for someone to have a big giant bottle of 800 milligram Motrin to take for, and we all know, well, not necessarily all of us, but when you do the research and understand what NSAIDs do to the gastrointestinal system, then yikes with that amount, and it just handed out for whatever.
Yeah. So lots to be thinking of through that key root. Of course, our 3 roots in functional nutrition are the genes, but we focus on the epigenetics, the circle of influence, the digestion, and inflammation, which brings us to this realm where we're talking about the number of immunizations and vaccinations that are required before deployment.
Yes. So in general, there's the, mandatory CDC schedule that is what every service member gets. But in remembering and talking through this with Brad, the before, pre-deployment is what it would be called. Often those are grouped. So you're getting 3, 4, 5, bunch of them all at one time, which is an immune onslaught, whether it's a life-saving vaccine or not. So it's inflammatory to begin with. But a lot of, I'll call them non-standard vaccines, like typhoid, yellow fever, smallpox. And I very specifically remember the 6-course schedule for the anthrax vaccine prior to deploying over to the Middle East, like 6 shots. And if you didn't do it in the time frame that was required, like if you did shot 1 and then you had, there's a certain amount of space before shot 2, but if you messed up that timing, you had to start over.
Oh, wow.
And so there are some people that could have had the anthrax vaccine 8, 9, 10 times because they had to start over the process. So just a lot of non-standard and multiple ones happening at one time before you're out the door.
Which we know is going to impact the gut and the immune system. So all
Yes.
of those vaccinations, recognizing that this is going to be a trigger. So when we're doing our histories and our timelines, we're recognizing what was used. Injuries and steroids, is that pretty common?
Yeah. Kind of like the vitamin M, for inflammatory, injuries, especially the physical training, like the sprains and the strains, steroids will be used to reduce inflammation
Right.
on a frequent basis. Yeah.
Okay, so getting that history, getting the use, not overriding that, it might be kind of, some of these things might be normalized for our clients or patients who have served, so they don't even think to share it, which is where that timelining session really comes into play, where we can go to that next level of questioning, knowing that they served. Okay, we touched on some of that those environmental pieces, Kate.
Yep.
What else would you want to share in that arena that we would be thinking through? I'm sure like it depends, because the area they serve, where they live, right? Like it depends.
Yeah, it does. It does depend. Some of the ones that I wrote because it had happened through, clients that I had talked to, was mold exposure. Like when you ask that question very basically on the intake, they're like, no, I haven't been exposed to mold. And then I go, okay, but wait, over here, you told me you were stationed in England for this specific amount of time and you lived in a really old house. And then they go, oh yeah, there was mold all over the walls of that house. Like that, that kind of thought process. Like,
right.
I think when they're thinking like mold exposure, like, were they eating
black
it or
mold
something?
Right.
Lots of older military base housing is still, even as of June of 2020, they did a report, I looked it up, that there were still lots of older military homes on bases that had mold problems. And there are even older ones that hopefully are all gone by now that had asbestos. So, but mold in the older homes, especially in more humid areas, is something to consider depending on where they were stationed.
And then we get to water, all personal products, like what do we have available to us, and
right,
thinking through
especially
time period, right?
Yeah, and especially deployed. The personal care products are, the Ivory soap and the whatever's the kind of the cheapest and easiest to get over there. So,
right.
But yes, like the water quality completely depends on the location, but a lot of times you'll have, especially if you're near an airfield, you'll have the JP8 runoff that ends up in the water. So jet fuel in water. Those fumes are there. The other ugly one is the burn pits. Anybody that did time, especially, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, and then even passed into Operation Iraqi Freedom. And those, there was no waste disposal at that point because it was such a new thing. And so they would literally dig a big hole and throw all the trash, human waste, everything in there, light it on fire. And that was, people had the duty of stirring.
Yep.
Like that was their job. And tons of respiratory issues, obviously, and even toxic exposure from whatever was being burned.
Yeah, such an important piece. And again, more questions to ask. Somebody might not share with you how much they were working with the burn pit, right? Like, I don't even know how to say that, but like, they might not share that with you. Also, it might not be a place of pride in their service. So they may not share that, but it's an important piece for us to understand in terms of their exposures. We also have chemical weapons, air quality, so many different things to be thinking through. And we could have the perfect storm, so to speak, where there's a lot of exposures that somebody's had at one time or over time.
Right. So imagine, a load of 5 or 6 vaccines before deployment. Then you get to the deployment and you have to eat MREs because at the very beginning, that's all that's available. And you're either at an airfield, with JP8 fumes, or you're doing the burn pits. And oh, by the way, depending on where you're going, you may have gotten a prophylactic dose of ciprofloxacin before leaving, to make sure that everything was killed. And we all know what that does to the gut too. So
Right.
yes.
Right.
Yep.
So Kate, I'm going to jump us to the detoxification node because it's so related, but because while we're looking at people who are having all these potential exposures, we're also looking at things that would compromise detoxification. So how do we start to think about that for serving people, like people who have served, us serving people who have served in the military? Why sleep deprivation? Why alcohol usage? Why these things that you're saying here?
Well, we know that, water and keeping things flowing is one of the best ways to detoxify, both, through sweat and pee and everything else. But depending on the environment that you're in, drinking water constantly isn't necessarily a habit pattern, especially if you're sitting at a desk. But then also if you are out out in the field, whether that be in a Humvee or out, and depending on if it's a hotter climate, how much water you put in your Camelback or how much you're drinking, and whether or not the water is even potable where you've gone. So there, the stories are all over the place of, it was easier for me to just drink Coke.
Right.
Because I couldn't find clean water.
Right.
So that obviously that impedes detoxification. And then if you add on I put it under mediators as well, because it's stressful situations. There tends to be, I need to chill out in some way, shape, or form. So depending on where you are, that's, after a sortie, which is a flight, you'd come in and grab your buddies and go to the bar and have a drink, or holy cow, I just got back from whatever, or just, it can go with the camaraderie, it can go with stressful situations, but it's there. And we know that impedes the liver function. So it impedes detoxification of all the other things on the matrix that need to get out of the body.
Right. So many things. If we think about all the detoxification, our detoxification go-tos, right? And I just did a podcast. I was on Eileen Laird's Phoenix Helix podcast talking about detoxifying foods. Those are absent, the detoxifying foods that help the liver, the hydration, the sleep being compromised, the alcohol usage. So we've impaired the ability to get the stuff out. I was going to just note, I was hiking with my boyfriend, and he had a day of hiking where he came off the hike and had blood in his urine. And it was due to dehydration and to elevation. And so just to say, it was easier for him not to hydrate because he didn't want to be peeing so much on the trail. Imagine the reality of people who are it's easier to drink a Coke or not to hydrate. And then the urogenital issues that can occur over time. He's fine because it was a acute incident, but we think about that throughout a longer period of time, what can occur. It's pretty profound to think about those scenarios that then initiate certain behaviors and then downstream health challenges.
And it's not like you can put a salad in an MRE.
Right. Right. So all those antioxidants. Let's head over to the right side of the matrix, the area we like to call the skills. So we looked at the story. We are all unique. We looked at the soup. Everything is connected. This is our area where all things matter. So this is where we get to start to think into both, as you said, the pluses and the minuses. Where are we thinking about how we actually help service members? But you mentioned here some of the negatives and positives. So we talked about lack of sleep, but this goes into a little bit more detail. Walk us through sleep and relaxation.
So it's very common for there to be much longer than what you would consider an average workday. 12 to 16 hours, depending on what you're doing. And then there's shift work that's involved, because there are some some duty stations, some jobs, some locations where it's a 24/7 operation. And so there has to be somebody working the night shift. And so that is a completely flipped circadian rhythm, which Deepa has a new thing on that one too that I want to read, which it looks really interesting to me. But that affects all kinds of things. It affects blood sugar. It affects obviously detoxification, all of our hormones, because your adrenal glands are on hypervigilance. So there is a greater propensity for sleep deprivation or circadian rhythm being off, just because there are times and places that have to be manned all the time.
Yeah, so important. Before we get to exercise and movement, I'm going to share that Gail is sharing that heavy metals and petrols, of course, we can add under environmental tox inputs, and we can even add those before we publish the PDF matrix. And parasites would go under immune and inflammatory balances as well. So I'm sure there is a lot of exposure to things, again, like other insults or immune insults we're not as familiar with.
Right. Those are the, yes, exotic, sometimes multiple infections that are under the triggers. Yeah. And there is heavy metal discussed under the oxidative stress and energy production, because that multiple explosions, even multiple firings of a weapon, you get the residue right there in your face that is heavy metal.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I skipped us over that area. So we could get to the skills, but I see it there now. So exercise, we think of it as a very physical environment. I mean, that's my notion of serving.
There is mandatory physical fitness requirements, and often those can be different depending on the career field. The special ops has a very specific combat skills fitness test, which is the same for all genders, by the way. There are some differences in some of the other PT tests, but the very generic one doesn't necessarily measure overall fitness, because you have to run 1.5 miles, do some push-ups and some sit-ups. So that doesn't necessarily measure someone's overall health, just that they can run 1.5 miles and do some push-ups and some sit-ups. And PT activities, depending on where you are not usually tailored to the individual. They're usually, if somebody's doing group PT, they're doing one thing altogether, and that may not be the best thing for every individual. But there is movement typically required.
Right. And maybe not meeting the needs of where somebody is in their healing journey or whatever's going on physically and physiologically.
Yes.
Yeah. So in the nutrition and hydration area, we touched on this quite a bit with the dining facilities and the MREs and the lack of hydration. Anything else you want to point out there that we would bring to awareness in the kind of negative arena?
We touched on a lot regarding that. I did put in there a book that's kind of fun, called The Combat Ready Kitchen. Backwards.
No, it won't be backwards.
You're right.
Backwards.
Backwards to me. It just talks about some of the initial, studies of preservatives and things like that, that were done by the military, which kind of started the evolution of processed food. So it's an interesting read. That's why I put it in there.
Great. Awesome. When it comes to stress and resilience, this seems like it's the whole thing. It's all sorts of stressors. But is there anything, Kate, that you would point out in particular? The one that stands out for me is the realization for those of us who haven't lived in this 1% of the community that leaving is stressful.
It is. Yes. And, again, depending on the time frame, but I can personally share around that 20-year time period, which is, that's for a retirement, that's the 20 years is the requirement to have a military retirement. What you're going to do after that can be very stressful, because for the last 20 years, you've been told what to wear every day. You've been told, this is your job, this is where you'll go. And, for some, you've been given 3 square meals a day for a certain amount of time. And so I joked with Brad and likened it to the getting out of prison. Like, what do I do in the real world?
Right.
Like, that in and of itself can be a trigger and a stressor.
Right. So important. Yeah. I'm going to leave the matrix for a moment now, Kate. We will make sure it's updated, make a PDF, post it into the YouTube channel. I want to bring you on here to both appreciate and applaud the work you did here to help think through this, to help me, Kate, really understand. This work for me is really, really important when we look at different patient populations. Again, recognizing that everybody is an N of one. Every single client or patient is unique. And yet there is kind of an empathy matrix, a way we can think through a patient population so that we can better meet them where they are, better serve their needs. And I couldn't do this next step in this arena, Kate, without your support and all the work that you've put in place. So I just want to really thank you for doing this work. And I wanted to ask you, like, what does doing this work, kind of merging that life experience with your functional nutrition training, mean to you?
That I'm going to try to answer that without being weepy. So first of all, I have to thank you back because you have brought this to the forefront for so many people. And it's something that I have been thinking through honestly for years in how to break in and help people to see past a conventional model. So to be able to do that, both with the clients that I see that are service members or veterans, and just being able to say it and get it out there is huge. It means the world to me. It literally is something I've been thinking about for close to as old as Zoe is, so 16 years. Because, and the other thing is I look at, the most recent statistics shows that 2/3 of the money spent by the VA is spent on multiple chronic conditions for people. And knowing now what I know that we can do to help that not be the case, makes me want to stand up on a mountain and scream.
Yeah. And you and I'm grateful to give you a platform to bring this together. I couldn't do it without you, but Kate, we can't do it without everybody here. Like, we all need to bring a functional nutrition understanding to serving the population, because they're not getting the holistic, the functional care that they need in most instances. There are other organizations, as you and I are uncovering, that are doing similar work. And I think if we could all come together, if we can all be speaking the same language, we can make a bigger impact. So I just really, my call to action is, how do we all bring this understanding to this population, among others, but this particular understanding to this population of clients and patients, and connect up with each other so that we're making the bigger difference. Yes, the individual, and yes, the population.
And the clinicians that service them.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. Kate, thank you so much for joining me. It's such a pleasure to be working with you on all of this and discussing it with you. And I learn so much from you each and every time. Mwah! I adore you, and we love spending the time with all of you. Thank you for being with us. We'll get you that matrix in the YouTube chat comments, and we'll hope to see you for continued conversations on this topic. Bye.